Chapter 14 of Mr. Standfast. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. Mr. Blenkiron discourses on love and war. 3 days later I got my orders to report at Paris for special service. They came none too soon, for I chafed at each hour's delay. Every thought in my head was directed to the game which we were playing against Ivory. He was the big enemy, compared to whom the ordinary Boche in the trenches was innocent and friendly. I had almost lost interest in my division, for I knew that for me the real battlefront was not in Picardy, and that my job was not so easy as holding a length of line. Also, I longed to be at the same work as Mary. I remember waking up in billets the morning after the night at the chateau with the feeling that I had become extraordinarily rich. I felt very humble, too, and very kindly towards all the world, even to the Boche, though I can't say I had ever hated him very wildly. You find hate more among journalists and politicians at home than among fighting men. I wanted to be quiet and alone to think, and since that was impossible, I went about my work in a happy abstraction. I tried not to look ahead, but only to live in the present, remembering that a war was on, and that there was desperate and dangerous work before me, and that my hopes hung on a slender thread. Yet for all that I had sometimes to let my fancies go free and revel in delicious dreams. But there was one thought that always brought me back to hard ground, and that was Ivory. I do not think I hated anybody in the world but him. It was his relation to Mary that stung me. He had the insolence, with all his toad-like past, to make love to that clean and radiant girl. I felt that he and I stood as mortal antagonists, and the thought pleased me, for it helped me to put some honest detestation into my job. Also, I was going to win. Twice I had failed, but the third time I should succeed. It had been like ranging shots for a gun. First short, second over, and I vowed that the third should be dead on the mark. I was summoned to GHQ, where I had half an hour's talk with the greatest British commander. I can see yet his patient, kindly face, and that steady eye which no vicissitude of fortune could perturb. He took the biggest view, for he was statesman as well as soldier, and I knew that the whole world was one battlefield, and every man and woman among the combatant nations was in the battle line. So contradictory is human nature, that talk made me wish for a moment to stay where I was. I wanted to go on serving under that man. I realized suddenly how much I loved my work, and when I got back to my quarters that night and saw my men swinging in from a route march, I could have howled like a dog at leaving them. Though I say it who shouldn't, there wasn't a better division in the army. One morning, a few days later, I picked up Mary in Amiens. I always liked the place, for after the dirt of the Somme, it was a comfort to go there for a bath and a square meal, and it had the noblest church that the hand of man ever built for God. It was a clear morning when we started from the boulevard beside the railway station, and the air smelt of washed streets and fresh coffee, and women were going marketing, and the little trams ran clanking by, just as in any other city far from the sound of guns. There was very little khaki or horizon blue about, and I remember thinking how completely Amiens had got out of the war zone. 2 months later, it was a different story. To the end, I shall count that day as one of the happiest in my life. Spring was in the air, though the trees and fields had still their winter colouring. 1,000 good fresh scents came out of the earth, and the larks were busy over the new furrows. I remember that we ran up a little glen, where a stream spread into pools among sallows, and the roadside trees were heavy with mistletoe. On the tableland beyond the Somme valley, the sun shone like April. At Beauvais we lunched badly in an inn, badly as to food, but there was an excellent Burgundy at 2 francs a bottle. Then we slipped down through little flat-chested townships to the Seine, and in the late afternoon passed through the Saint-Germain forest. The wide green spaces among the trees set my fancy dwelling on that divine English countryside where Mary and I would one day make our home. She had been in high spirits all the journey, but when I spoke of the Cotswolds her face grew grave. "Don't let us speak of it, Dick," she said. It's too happy a thing, and I feel as if it would wither if we touched it. I don't let myself think of peace and home, for it makes me too homesick. I think we shall get there some day, you and I, but it's a long road to the Delectable Mountains, and Faithful, you know, has to die first. There is a price to be paid." The words sobered me. "Who is our Faithful?" I asked. "I don't know, but he was the best of the pilgrims." Then, as if a veil had lifted, her mood changed, and when we came through the suburbs of Paris and swung down the Champs-Élysées, she was in a holiday humour. The lights were twinkling in the blue January dusk, and the warm breath of the city came to greet us. I knew little of the place, for I had visited only once on a 4 days' Paris leave, but it had seemed to me then the most habitable of cities, and now, coming from the battlefield with Mary by my side, it was like the happy ending of a dream. I left her at her cousin's house near the Rue Saint-Honoré, and deposited myself, according to instructions, at the Hôtel Louis XV. There I wallowed in a hot bath and got into the civilian clothes which had been sent on from London. They made me feel that I had taken leave of my division for good and all this time. Blenkiron had a private room where we were to dine, and a more wonderful litter of books and cigar boxes I have never seen, for he hadn't a notion of tidiness. I could hear him grunting at his toilet in the adjacent bedroom, and I noticed that the table was laid for 3. I went downstairs to get a paper, and on the way ran into Lancelot Wake. He was no longer a private in a Labour battalion. Evening clothes showed beneath his overcoat. "Hello, Wake, are you in this push too?" "I suppose so," he said, and his manner was not cordial. "Anyhow, I was ordered down here. My business is to do as I'm told." "Coming to dine?" I asked. "No, I'm dining with some friends at the Crillon." Then he looked me in the face, and his eyes were hot as I first remembered them. "I hear I've to congratulate you, Hannay," and he held out a limp hand. I never felt more antagonism in a human being. "You don't like it," I said, for I guessed what he meant. "How on earth can I like it?" he cried angrily. "Good Lord, man, you'll murder her soul. You, an ordinary, stupid, successful fellow, and she's the most precious thing God ever made. You can never understand a fraction of her preciousness, but you'll clip her wings all right. She can never fly now." He poured out this hysterical stuff to me at the foot of the staircase, within hearing of an elderly French widow with a poodle. I had no impulse to be angry, for I was far too happy. "Don't, Wake," I said. "We're all too close together to quarrel. I'm not fit to Black Mary's shoes. You can't put me too low or her too high, but I've at least the sense to know it. You couldn't want me to be humbler than I felt." He shrugged his shoulders as he went out into the street. "Your infernal magnanimity would break any man's temper." I went upstairs to find Blenkiron, washed and shaven, admiring a pair of bright patent leather shoes. "Why, Dick, I've been wearying bad to see you. I was nervous you would be blown to glory, for I've been reading awful things about your battles in the newspapers. The war correspondents worry me so I can't take breakfast." He mixed cocktails and clinked his glass on mine. "Here's to the young lady. I was trying to write her a pretty little sonnet, but the darned rhymes wouldn't fit. I've gotten a heap of things to say to you when we've finished dinner." Mary came in, her cheeks bright from the weather, and Blenkiron promptly fell abashed. But she had a way to meet his shyness, for, when he began an embarrassed speech of good wishes, she put her arms round his neck and kissed him. Oddly enough, that set him completely at his ease. It was pleasant to eat off linen and china again, pleasant to see old Blenkiron's benignant face and the way he tucked into his food, but it was delicious for me to sit at a meal with Mary across the table. It made me feel that she was really mine, and not a pixie that would vanish at a word. To Blenkiron she bore herself like an affectionate but mischievous daughter, while the desperately refined manners that afflicted him whenever women were concerned mellowed into something like his everyday self. They did most of the talking, and I remember he fetched from some mysterious hiding-place a great box of chocolates, which you could no longer buy in Paris, and the two ate them like spoiled children. I didn't want to talk, for it was pure happiness for me to look on. I loved to watch her when the servants had gone, with her elbows on the table like a schoolboy, her crisp gold hair a little rumpled, cracking walnuts with gusto, like some child who has been allowed down from the nursery for dessert and means to make the most of it. With his first cigar, Blenkiron got to business. "You want to know about the staff work we've been busy on at home? Well, it's finished now, thanks to you, Dick. We weren't getting on very fast till you took to perusing the press on your sick bed and dropped us that hint about the deep breathing ads." "Then there was something in it?" I asked. "There was black hell in it. There wasn't any Gussiter, but there was a mighty fine little syndicate of crooks with old man Gresson at the back of them. First thing, I started out to get the cipher. It took some looking for, but there's no cipher on earth can't be got hold of somehow if you know it's there, and in this case we were helped a lot by the return messages in the German papers. It was bad stuff when we read it, and explained the dark leakages and important news we've been up against. At first I figured to keep the thing going and turn Gussiter into a corporation with John S. Blenkiron as president. But it wouldn't do, for at the first hint of tampering with their communications, the whole bunch got skeery and sent out SOS signals. So we tenderly plucked the flowers." "Gresson too?" I asked. He nodded. "I guess your seafaring companion's now under the sod. We had collected enough evidence to hang him 10 times over. But that was the least of it, for your little old cipher, Dick, gave us a line on ivory." I asked how, and Blenkiron told me the story. He had about a dozen cross bearings proving that the organization of the deep breathing game had its headquarters in Switzerland. He suspected ivory from the first, but the man had vanished out of his ken, so he started working from the other end, and instead of trying to deduce the Swiss business from ivory, he tried to deduce ivory from the Swiss business. He went to Bern and made a conspicuous public fool of himself for several weeks. He called himself an agent of the American propaganda there, and took some advertising space in the press, and put in spread-eagle announcements of his mission, with the result that the Swiss government threatened to turn him out of the country if he tampered that amount with their neutrality. He also wrote a lot of rot in the Geneva newspapers, which he paid to have printed, explaining how he was a pacifist and was going to convert Germany to peace by inspirational advertisement of pure-minded war aims. All this was in keeping with his English reputation, and he wanted to make himself a bait for ivory. But ivory did not rise to the fly, and though he had a dozen agents working for him on the quiet, he could never hear of the name Chelios. That was, he reckoned, a very private and particular name among the wild birds. However, he got to know a good deal about the Swiss end of the deep breathing business. That took some doing and cost a lot of money. His best people were a girl who posed as a mannequin in a milliner's shop in Lyon and a concierge in a big hotel at St. Moritz. His most important discovery was that there was a second cipher in the return messages sent from Switzerland, different from the one that the Gussiter lot used in England. He got this cipher, but though he could read it, he couldn't make anything out of it. He concluded that it was a very secret means of communication between the inner circle of the wild birds, and that ivory must be at the back of it. But he was still a long way from finding out anything that mattered. Then the whole situation changed, for Mary got in touch with Ivory. I must say she behaved like a shameless minx, for she kept on writing to him to an address he had once given her in Paris, and suddenly she got an answer. She was in Paris herself, helping to run one of the railway canteens, and staying with her French cousins, the de Mézières. One day he came to see her. That showed the boldness of the man and his cleverness, for the whole secret police of France were after him, and they never got within sight or sound. Yet here he was, coming openly in the afternoon to have tea with an English girl. It showed another thing which made me blaspheme. A man so resolute and single-hearted in his job must have been pretty badly in love to take a risk like that. He came, and he called himself the Capitaine Bommertz, with a transport job on the staff of the French GQG. He was on the staff right enough, too. Mary said that when she heard that name she nearly fell down. He was quite frank with her, and she with him. They are both peacemakers, ready to break the laws of any land for the sake of a great ideal. Goodness knows what stuff they talk together. Mary said she would blush to think of it till her dying day, and I gathered that on her side it was a mixture of Lancelot Wake at his most pedantic and schoolgirl silliness. He came again, and they met often, unbeknown to the decorous Madame de Mézières. They walked together in the Bois de Boulogne, and once with a beating heart she motored with him to Auteuil for luncheon. He spoke of his house in Picardy, and there were moments, I gathered, when he became the declared lover to be rebuffed with a hoydenish shyness. Presently the pace became too hot, and after some anguished arguments with Bullivant on the long-distance telephone, she went off to Douvecourt to Lady Manorwater's hospital. She went there to escape from him, but mainly, I think, to have a look, trembling in every limb, mind you, at the chateau of Eaucourt-Sainte-Anne. I had only to think of Mary to know just what Joan of Arc was. No man ever born could have done that kind of thing. It wasn't recklessness, it was sheer, calculating courage. Then Blenkiron took up the tale. The newspaper we found that Christmas Eve in the chateau was of tremendous importance, for Bommaerts had pricked out in the advertisement the very special second cipher of the wild birds. That proved that Ivory was at the back of the Swiss business, but Blenkiron made doubly sure. "I considered the time had come," he said, "to pay high for valuable news, so I sold the enemy a very pretty device. If you ever gave your mind to ciphers and illicit correspondence, Dick, you would know that the one kind of document you can't write on in invisible ink is a coated paper, the kind they use in the weeklies to print photographs of leading actresses and the stately homes of England. Anything wet that touches it corrugates the surface a little, and you can tell with a microscope if someone's been playing at it. Well, we had the good fortune to discover just how to get over that little difficulty, how to write on glazed paper with a quill so as the cutest analyst couldn't spot it, and likewise how to detect the writing. I decided to sacrifice that invention, casting my bread upon the waters and looking for a good-sized bakery in return. I had it sold to the enemy. The job wanted delicate handling, but the 10th man from me, he was an Austrian Jew, did the deal and scooped $50,000 out of it. Then I lay low to watch how my friend would use the device, and I didn't wait long. He took from his pocket a folded sheet of l'illustration. Over a photogravure plate ran some words in a large sprawling hand, as if written with a brush. "That page, when I got it yesterday," he said, "was an unassuming picture of General Pétain presenting military medals. There wasn't a scratch or a ripple on its surface. But I got busy with it, and see there." He pointed out 2 names. The writing was a set of key words we did not know, but 2 names stood out which I knew too well. They were Bommaerts and Chelius. "My God," I cried, "that's uncanny. It only shows that if you chew long enough—" "Dick," said Mary, "you mustn't say that again. At the best it's an ugly metaphor, and you're making it a platitude." "Who is Ivory, anyhow?" I asked. "Do you know more about him than we knew in the summer? Mary, what did Bommaerts pretend to be?" "An Englishman." Mary spoke in the most matter-of-fact tone, as if it were a perfectly usual thing to be made love to by a spy, and that rather soothed my annoyance. "When he asked me to marry him, he proposed to take me to a country house in Devonshire. I rather think, too, he had a place in Scotland. But, of course, he's a German." "Yes," said Blenkiron slowly. "I've got onto his record, and it isn't a pretty story. It's taken some working out, but I've got all the links tested now. He's a Boche and a large-sized nobleman in his own state. Did you ever hear of the Graf von Schwabing?" I shook my head. "I think I have heard Uncle Charlie speak of him," said Mary, wrinkling her brows. "He used to hunt with the Pytchley." "That's the man, but he hasn't troubled the Pytchley for the last 8 years. There was a time when he was the last thing in smartness in the German court. Officer in the Guards, ancient family, rich, darned clever, all the fixings. Kaiser liked him, and it's easy to see why. I guess a man who had as many personalities as the Graf was amusing after dinner company, especially among Germans who, in my experience, don't excel in the lighter vein. Anyway, he was William's white-headed boy, and there wasn't a mother with a daughter who wasn't out gunning for Otto von Schwabing. He was about as popular in London and New York, and in Paris too. Ask Sir Walter about him, Dick. He says he had twice the brains of Kuhlmann and better manners than that Austrian fellow he used to yarn about. Well, one day there came an almighty court scandal, and the bottom dropped out of the Graf's world. It was a pretty beastly story, and I don't gather that Schwabing was as deep in it as some others. But the trouble was that those others had to be shielded at all costs, and Schwabing was made the scapegoat. His name came out in the papers, and he had to go. "What was the case called?" I asked. Blenkiron mentioned a name, and I knew why the word Schwabing was familiar. I had read the story long ago in Rhodesia. "It was some smash," Blenkiron went on. "He was drummed out of the Guards, out of the clubs, out of the country. Now, how would you have felt, Dick, if you had been the Graf? Your life and work and happiness crossed out, and all to save a mangy princeling. Bitter as hell, you say, hungering for a chance to put it across the lot that had outed you. You wouldn't rest till you had William sobbing on his knees, asking your pardon, and you not thinking of granting it? That's the way you'd feel, but that wasn't the Graf's way, and what's more, it isn't the German way. He went into exile hating humanity, and with a heart all poison and snakes, but itching to get back. And I'll tell you why. It's because his kind of German hasn't got any other home on this earth. Oh yes, I know there's stacks of good old Teutons come and squat in our little country and turn into fine Americans. You can do a lot with them if you catch them young and teach them the Declaration of Independence and make them study our Sunday papers. But you can't deny there's something comic in the rough about all Germans before you've civilized them. They're a peculiar people, a darn peculiar people, else they wouldn't staff all the menial and indecent occupations in the globe. But that peculiarity, which is only skin deep in the working Boche, is in the bone of the grandee. Your German aristocracy can't consort on terms of equality with any other upper 10,000. They swagger and bluff about the world, but they know very well that the world's sniggering at them. They're like a boss from Salt Creek Gully who's made his pile and bought a dress suit and dropped into a Newport evening party. They don't know where to put their hands or how to keep their feet still. Your copper-bottomed English nobleman has got to keep jogging himself to treat them as equals instead of sending them down to the servants' hall. Their fine fixings are just the high light that reveals the everlasting J. They can't be gentlemen because they aren't sure of themselves. The world laughs at them, and they know it, and it riles them like hell. That's why when a Graf is booted out of the fatherland, he's got to creep back somehow or be a wandering Jew for the rest of time." Blenkiron lit another cigar and fixed me with his steady, ruminating eye. "For 8 years the man has slaved, body and soul, for the men who degraded him. He's earned his restoration, and I dare say he's got it in his pocket. If merit was rewarded, he should be covered with iron crosses and red eagles. He had a pretty good hand to start out with. He knew other countries, and he was a dandy at languages. More, he had an uncommon gift for living apart. That is real genius, Dick, however much it gets up against us. Best of all, he had a first-class outfit of brains. I can't say I ever struck a better, and I've come across some bright citizens in my time. And now he's going to win out unless we get mighty busy." There was a knock at the door, and the solid figure of Andrew Amos revealed itself. "It's time you was home, Miss Mary. It's sharp at 11:30 as I came up the stairs. It's coming on to rain, so I've brought an umbrelly." "One word," I said. "How old is the man?" "Just gone 36, Blenkiron replied. I turned to Mary, who nodded. "Younger than you, Dick," she said wickedly, as she got into her big Jaeger coat. "I'm going to see you home," I said. "Not allowed. You've had quite enough of my society for one day. Andrew's on escort duty tonight." Blenkiron looked after her as the door closed. "I reckon you've got the best girl in the world." "Ivory thinks the same," I said grimly, for my detestation of the man who had made love to Mary fairly choked me. You can see why. Here's this degenerate coming out of his rotten class, all pampered and petted and satiated with the easy pleasures of life. He has seen nothing of women except the bad kind and the overfed specimens of his own country. I hate being impolite about females, but I've always considered the German variety uncommon like cows. He has had desperate years of intrigue and danger, and consorting with every kind of scalawag. Remember, he's a big man and a poet, with a brain and an imagination that takes every grade without changing gears. Suddenly he meets something that is as fresh and lovely as a spring flower, and has wits too, and the steeliest courage, and yet is all youth and gaiety. It's a new experience for him, a kind of revelation, and he's big enough to value her as she should be valued. No, Dick, I can understand you getting cross, but I reckon it an item to the man's credit." "It's his blind spot all the same," I said. "His blind spot," Blenkiron repeated solemnly, "and please God, we're going to remember that." Next morning, in miserable, sloppy weather, Blenkiron carted me about Paris. We climbed 5 sets of stairs to a flat away up in Montmartre, where I was talked to by a fat man with spectacles and a slow voice, and told various things that deeply concerned me. Then I went to a room in the Boulevard Saint-Germain, with a little cabinet opening off it, where I was shown papers and maps and some figures on a sheet of paper that made me open my eyes. We lunched in a modest cafe tucked away behind the Palais Royal, and our companions were 2 Alsatians who spoke German better than a Boche and had no names, only numbers. In the afternoon I went to a low building beside the Invalides, and saw many generals, including more than one whose features were familiar in 2 hemispheres. I told them everything about myself, and I was examined like a convict, and all particulars about my appearance and manner of speech written down in a book. That was to prepare the way for me, in case of need, among the vast army of those who work underground and know their chief but do not know each other. The rain cleared before night, and Blenkiron and I walked back to the hotel through that lemon-coloured dusk that you get in a French winter. We passed a company of American soldiers, and Blenkiron had to stop and stare. I could see that he was stiff with pride, though he wouldn't show it. "What do you think of that bunch?" he asked. "First-rate stuff," I said. "The men are all right," he drawled critically, "but some of the officer boys are a bit puffy. They want fining down." "They'll get it soon enough, honest fellows. You can't keep your weight long in this war." "Say, Dick," he said shyly, "what do you truly think of our Americans? You've seen a lot of them, and I'd value your views." His tone was that of a bashful author asking for an opinion on his first book. "I'll tell you what I think. You're constructing a great middle-class army, and that's the most formidable fighting machine on earth. This kind of war doesn't want the berserker so much as the quiet fellow with a trained mind and a lot to fight for. The American ranks are filled with all sorts, from cowpunchers to college boys, but mostly with decent lads that have good prospects in life before them, and are fighting because they feel they're bound to, not because they like it. It was the same stock that pulled through your Civil War. We have a middle-class division too, Scottish territorials, mostly clerks and shopmen and engineers and farmers' sons. When I first struck them, my only crab was that the officers weren't much better than the men. It's still true, but the men are super excellent, and consequently so are the officers. That division gets top marks in the Boche calendar for sheer fighting devilment. And please God, that's what your American army's going to be. You can wash out the old idea of a regiment of scalawags commanded by dukes. That was right enough, maybe, in the days when you hurrooshed into battle waving a banner, but it don't do with high explosives and a couple of million men on each side and a battlefront of 500 miles. The hero of this war is the plain man out of the middle class who wants to get back to his home and is going to use all the brains and grit he possesses to finish the job soon." "That sounds about right," said Blenkiron reflectively. "It pleases me some, for you've maybe guessed that I respect the British Army quite a little. Which part of it do you put top?" "All of it's good. The French are keen judges, and they give front place to the Scots and the Australians. For myself, I think the backbone of the army is the old-fashioned English county regiments that hardly ever get into the papers. Though I don't know, if I had to pick, but I'd take the South Africans. There's only a brigade of them, but they're hell's delight in a battle. But then you'll say I'm prejudiced." "Well," drawled Blenkiron, "you're a mighty empire anyhow. I've sojourned up and down it, and I can't guess how the old-time highbrows in your little island came to put it together. But I'll let you into a secret, Dick. I read this morning in a newspaper that there was a natural affinity between Americans and the men of the British dominions. Take it from me, there isn't, at least not with this American. I don't understand them one little bit. When I see your lean, tall Australians with the sun at the back of their eyes, I'm looking at men from another planet. Outside you and Peter, I never got to fathom a South African. The Canadians live over the fence from us, but you mix up a Canuck with a Yank in your remarks and you'll get a bat in the eye. But most of us Americans have gotten a grip on your old country. You'll find us mighty respectful to other parts of your empire, but we say anything we damn well please about England. You see, we know her that well and like her that well, we can be free with her. It's like," he concluded as we reached the hotel, "it's like a lot of boys that are getting on in the world and are a bit jealous and standoffish with each other. But they're all at home with the old man who used to warm them up with a hickory cane, even though sometimes in their haste they called him a stand patter." That night at dinner we talked solid business, Blenkiron and I, and a young French colonel from the 3e section at GQG. Blenkiron, I remember, got very hurt about being called a businessman by the Frenchman, who thought he was paying him a compliment. "Cut it out," he said. "It's a word that's gone bad with me. There's just two kinds of men, those who've gotten sense and those who haven't. A big percentage of us Americans make our living by trading, but we don't think because a man's in business, or even because he's made big money, that he's any natural good at every job. We've made a college professor our president, and do what he tells us like little boys, though he don't earn more than some of us pay our works manager. You English have gotten business on the brain, and think a fellow's a dandy at handling your government if he happens to have made a pile by some flat-catching ramp on your stock exchange. It makes me tired. You're about the best business nation on earth, but for God's sake don't begin to talk about it, or you'll lose your power. And don't go confusing real business with the ordinary gift of raking in the dollars. Any man with sense could make money if he wanted to, but he mayn't want. He may prefer the fun of the job and let other people do the looting. I reckon the biggest business on the globe today is the work behind your lines and the way you feed and supply and transport your army. It beats the Steel Corporation and the Standard Oil to a frazzle. But the man at the head of it all don't earn more than $1,000 a month. Your nation's getting to worship Mammon, Dick. Cut it out. There's just the one difference in humanity, sense or no sense. And most likely you won't find any more sense in the man that makes $1 billion selling bonds than in his brother Tim that lives in a shack and sells corn cobs. I'm not speaking out of sinful jealousy, for there was a day when I was reckoned a railroad king, and I quit with a bigger pile than kings usually retire on. But I haven't the sense of old Peter, who never even had a bank account, and it's sense that wins in this war. The colonel, who spoke good English, asked a question about a speech which some politician had made. "There isn't all the sense I'd like to see at the top," said Blenkiron. "They're fine, smooth words. That wouldn't matter, but they're thinking smooth thoughts. What do you make of the situation, Dick?" "I think it's the worst since first Ypres," I said. "Everybody's cock-a-hoop, but God knows why." "God knows why," Blenkiron repeated. "I reckon it's a simple calculation, and you can't deny it any more than a mathematical law. Russia is counted out. The Boche won't get food from her for a good many months, but he can get more men, and he's got them. He's fighting only on one foot, and he's been able to bring troops and guns west, so he's as strong as the Allies now on paper, and he's stronger in reality. He's got better railways behind him, and he's fighting on inside lines and can concentrate fast against any bit of our front. I'm no soldier, but that's so, Dick?" The Frenchman smiled and shook his head. "All the same, they will not pass. They could not when they were 2-1 in 1914, and they will not now. If we Allies could not break through in the last year when we had many more men, how will the Germans succeed now with only equal numbers." Blenkiron did not look convinced. "That's what they all say. I talked to a general last week about the coming offensive, and he said he was praying for it to hurry up, for he reckoned Fritz would get the fright of his life. It's a good spirit, maybe, but I don't think it's sound on the facts. We've got two mighty great armies of fine fighting men, but because we've two commands, we're bound to move ragged like a peal of bells. The Hun's got one army and 40 years of stiff tradition, and what's more, he's going all out this time. He's going to smash our front before America lines up, or perish in the attempt. Why do you suppose all the peace racket in Germany has died down, and the very men that were talking democracy in the summer are now hot for fighting to a finish? I'll tell you. It's because old Ludendorff has promised them complete victory this spring if they spend enough men, and the Boche is a good gambler and is out to risk it. We're not up against a local attack this time. We're standing up to a great nation going bald-headed for victory or destruction. If we're broken, then America's got to fight a new campaign by herself when she's ready, and the Boche has time to make Russia his feeding ground and diddle our blockade. That puts another 5 years onto the war, maybe another 10. Are we free and independent people going to endure that much? I tell you, we're tossing to quit before Easter." He turned towards me, and I nodded assent. "That's more or less my view," I said. "We ought to hold, but it'll be by our teeth and nails. For the next 6 months we'll be fighting without any margin." "But, my friends, you put it too gravely," cried the Frenchman. "We may lose a mile or two of ground, yes, but serious danger is not possible. They had better chances at Verdun, and they failed. Why should they succeed now?" "Because they are staking everything," Blenkiron replied. "It's the last desperate struggle of a wounded beast, and in these struggles sometimes the hunter perishes. Dick's right. We've got a wasting margin, and every extra ounce of weight's going to tell. The battle's in the field, and it's also in every corner of every Allied land. That's why within the next 2 months we've got to get even with the wild birds." The French colonel, his name was de Vallière, smiled at the name, and Blenkiron answered my unspoken question. "I'm going to satisfy some of your curiosity, Dick, for I've put together considerable news of the menagerie. Germany has a good army of spies outside her borders. We shoot a batch now and then, but the others go on working like beavers, and they do a mighty deal of harm. They're beautifully organized, but they don't draw on such good human material as we, and I reckon they don't pay in results more than 10 cents on a dollar of trouble. But there they are. They're the intelligence officers, and their business is just to forward news. They're the birds in the cage, what is it your friend called them?" "Die Stubenvögel," I said. "Yes, but all the birds aren't caged. There are few outside the bars, and they don't collect news. They do things. If there's anything desperate, they're put on the job, and they've got power to act without waiting on instructions from home. I've investigated till my brain's tired, and I haven't made out more than half a dozen whom I can say for certain are in the business. There's your pal, the Portuguese Jew, Dick. Another's a woman in Genoa, a princess of some sort married to a Greek financier. One's the editor of a pro-Ally up-country paper in the Argentine. One passes as a Baptist minister in Colorado. One was a police spy in the Tsar's government and is now a red-hot revolutionary in the Caucasus. And the biggest, of course, is Moxon Ivory, who in happier times was the Graf von Schwabing. There aren't above 100 people in the world know of their existence, and these 100 call them the wild birds." "Do they work together?" I asked. "Yes, they each get their own jobs to do, but they're apt to flock together for a big piece of devilment. There were 4 of them in France a year ago before the Battle of the Aisne, and they pretty near rotted the French army. That's so, Colonel?" The soldier nodded grimly. "They seduced our weary troops, and they bought many politicians. Almost they succeeded, but not quite. The nation is sane again, and is judging and shooting the accomplices at its leisure. But the principals we have never caught." "You hear that, Dick?" said Blenkiron. "You're satisfied this isn't a whimsy of a melodramatic old Yank? I'll tell you more. You know how Ivory worked the submarine business from England. Also, it was the wild birds that wrecked Russia. It was Ivory that paid the Bolshevists to seduce the army, and the Bolshevists took his money for their own purposes, thinking they were playing a deep game, when all the time he was grinning like Satan, for they were playing his. It was Ivory, or some other of the bunch, that doped the brigades that broke at Caporetto. If I started in to tell you the history of their doings, you wouldn't go to bed, and if you did, you wouldn't sleep. There's just this to it. Every finished, subtle devilry that the Boche has wrought among the Allies since August 1914 has been the work of the wild birds and more or less organized by Ivory. They're worth half a dozen army corps to Ludendorff. They're the mightiest poison merchants the world ever saw, and they've the nerve of hell. I don't know, I interrupted. Ivory's got his soft spot. I saw him in the tube station. Maybe, but he's got the kind of nerve that's wanted. And now I rather fancy he's whistling in his flock. Blenkiron consulted a notebook. Pavia, that's the Argentine man. Started last month for Europe. He transshipped from a coasting steamer in the West Indies, and we've temporarily lost track of him, but he's left his hunting ground. What do you reckon that means? It means, Blenkiron continued solemnly, that Ivory thinks the game's nearly over, the play's working up for the big climax, and that climax is going to be damnation for the Allies unless we get a move on. Right, I said. That's what I'm here for. What's the move? The wild birds mustn't ever go home when the man they call Ivory or Montmartre or Calius has to decease. It's a cold-blooded proposition, but it's him of the world that's got to break. But before he quits this earth, we're bound to get wise about some of his plans, and that means that we can't just shoot a pistol at his face. Also, we've got to find him first. We reckon he's in Switzerland, but that is a state with quite a lot of diversified scenery to lose a man in. Still, I guess we'll find him. But it's the kind of business to plan out as carefully as a battle. I'm going back to Bern on my old stunt to boss the show, and I'm giving the orders. You're an obedient child, Dick, so I don't reckon on any trouble that way. Then Blenkiron did an ominous thing. He pulled up a little table and started to lay out patience cards. Since his duodenum was cured, he seemed to have dropped that habit, and from his resuming it I gathered that his mind was uneasy. I can see that scene as if it were yesterday, the French colonel in an armchair smoking a cigarette in a long amber holder, and Blenkiron sitting primly on the edge of a yellow silk ottoman, dealing his cards and looking guiltily towards me. "You'll have Peter for company," he said. "Peter's a sad man, but he has a great heart, and he's been mighty useful to me already. They're going to move him to England very soon. The authorities are afraid of him, for he's apt to talk wild, his health having made him peevish about the British. But there's a deal of red tape in the world, and the orders for his repatriation are slow in coming." The speaker winked very slowly and deliberately with his left eye. I asked if I was to be with Peter, much cheered at the prospect. "Why, yes, you and Peter are the collateral in the deal, but the big game's not with you." I had a presentiment of something coming, something anxious and unpleasant. "Is Mary in it?" I asked. He nodded and seemed to pull himself together for an explanation. "See here, Dick, our main job is to get Ivory back to Allied soil where we can handle him, and there's just the one magnet that can fetch him back. You aren't going to deny that." I felt my face getting very red, and that ugly hammer began beating in my forehead. Two grave, patient eyes met my glare. "I'm damned if I'll allow it," I said. "I've got some right to a say in the thing. I won't have Mary made a decoy. It's too infernally degrading." "It isn't pretty, but war isn't pretty, and nothing we do is pretty. I'd have blushed like a rose when I was young and innocent to imagine the things I've put my hand to in the last 3 years. But have you any other way, Dick? I'm not proud, and I'll scrap the plan if you can show me another. Night after night I've hammered the thing out, and I can't hit on a better. Hey-ho, Dick, this isn't like you." And he grinned ruefully. "You're making yourself a fine argument in favour of celibacy, in time of war, anyhow. What is it the poet sings? White hands cling to the bridle rein, slipping the spur from the booted heel." I was as angry as sin, but I felt all the time I had no case. Blenkiron stopped his game of patience, sending the cards flying over the carpet, and straddled on the hearthrug. "You're never going to be a piker. What's duty if you won't carry it to the other side of hell? What's the use of yapping about your country if you're going to keep anything back when she calls for it? What's the good of meaning to win the war if you don't put every cent you've got on your stake? You'll make me think you're like the Jacks in your English novels that chuck in their hand and say it's up to God and call that seeing it through. No, Dick, that kind of duty don't deserve a blessing. You dursn't keep back anything if you want to save your soul. Besides, he went on, what a girl it is. She can't scare and she can't soil. She's white-hot youth and innocence, and she'd take no more harm than clean steel from a muck-heap. I knew I was badly in the wrong, but my pride was all raw. I'm not going to agree till I've talked to Mary. But Miss Mary has consented, he said gently. She made the plan. Next day, in clear blue weather that might have been May, I drove Mary down to Fontainebleau. We lunched in the inn by the bridge and walked into the forest. I hadn't slept much, for I was tortured by what I thought was anxiety for her, but which was in truth jealousy of Ivory. I don't think that I would have minded her risking her life, for that was part of the game we were both in, but I jibbed at the notion of Ivory coming near her again. I told myself it was honourable pride, but I knew deep down in me that it was jealousy. I asked her if she had accepted Blenkiron's plan, and she turned mischievous eyes on me. I knew I should have a scene with you, Dick. I told Mr. Blenkiron so. Of course I agreed. I'm not even very much afraid of it. I'm a member of the team, you know, and I must play up to my form. I can't do a man's work, so all the more reason why I should tackle the thing I can do. But, I stammered, it's such a degrading business for a child like you. I can't bear. It makes me hot to think of it. Her reply was merry laughter. You're an old Ottoman, Dick. You haven't doubled Cape Turk yet, and I don't believe you're round Seraglio Point. Why, women aren't the brittle things men used to think them. They never were, and the war has made them like whipcord. Bless you, my dear, we're the tougher sex now. We've had to wait and endure, and we've been so beaten on the anvil of patience that we've lost all our megrims. She put her hands on my shoulders and looked me in the eyes. Look at me, Dick. Look at your some day to be espoused saint. I'm 19 years of age next August. Before the war, I should have only just put my hair up. I should have been the kind of shivering debutante who blushes when she's spoken to, and oh, I should have thought such silly, silly things about life. Well, in the last 2 years, I've been close to it, and to death. I've nursed the dying. I've seen souls in agony and in triumph. England has allowed me to serve her as she allows her sons. Oh, I'm a robust young woman now, and indeed I think women were always robuster than men. Dick, dear Dick, we're lovers, but we're comrades too, always comrades, and comrades trust each other. I hadn't anything to say except contrition, for I had my lesson. I had been slipping away in my thoughts from the gravity of our task, and Mary had brought me back to it. I remember that as we walked through the woodland we came to a place where there were no signs of war. Elsewhere there were men busy felling trees and anti-aircraft guns and an occasional transport wagon, but here there was only a shallow grassy vale, and in the distance bloomed over like a plum in the evening haze the roofs of an old dwelling house among gardens. Mary clung to my arm as we drank in the peace of it. "This is what lies for us at the end of the road, Dick," she said softly. And then, as she looked, I felt her body shiver. She returned to the strange fancy she had had in the Saint-Germain woods 3 days before. "Somewhere it's waiting for us, and we shall certainly find it. But first we must go through the valley of the shadow, and there is the sacrifice to be made, the best of us." End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Mr. Standfast by John Buchan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15, Saranton. 10 days later, the porter, Joseph Zimmer of Arosa, clad in the tough and shapeless trousers of his class, but sporting an old velveteen shooting coat bequeathed to him by a former German master, speaking the guttural tongue of the Grisons, and with all his belongings in one massive rucksack, came out of the little station of Saranton and blinked in the frosty sunshine. He looked down upon the little old village beside its ice-bound lake, but his business was with the new village of hotels and villas which had sprung up in the last 10 years south of the station. He made some halting inquiries of the station people, and a cab driver outside finally directed him to the place he sought, the cottage of the widow Zummermattel, where resided an English interne, one Peter Pienaar. The porter, Joseph Zimmer, had had a long and roundabout journey. A fortnight before he had worn the uniform of a British Major General. As such he had been the inmate of an expensive Paris hotel, till one morning in grey tweed clothes and with a limp, he had taken the Paris Mediterranean Express with a ticket for an officer's convalescent home at Cannes. Thereafter he had declined in the social scale. At Dijon he had been still an Englishman, but at Pontarlier he had become an American bagman of Swiss parentage, returning to wind up his father's estate. At Berne he limped excessively, and at Zurich, at a little back street hotel, he became frankly the peasant. For he met a friend there from whom he acquired clothes with that odd rank smell, far stronger than Harris tweed, which marks the raiment of most Swiss guides and all Swiss porters. He also acquired a new name and an old aunt, who a little later received him with open arms and explained to her friends that he was her brother's son from Arosa, who 3 winters ago had hurt his leg wood-cutting and had been discharged from the levee. A kindly Swiss gentleman, as it chanced, had heard of the deserving Joseph, and interested himself to find him employment. The said philanthropist made a hobby of the French and British prisoners returned from Germany, and had in mind an officer, a crabbed South African with a bad leg, who needed a servant. He was, it seemed, an ill-tempered old fellow, who had to be billeted alone, and since he could speak German, he would be happier with a Swiss native. Joseph haggled somewhat over the wages, but on his aunt's advice he accepted the job, and with a very complete set of papers and a store of ready-made reminiscences — it took him some time to swat up the names of the peaks and passes he had traversed — set out for St. Anton, having dispatched beforehand a monstrously ill-spelt letter announcing his coming. He could barely read and write, but he was good at maps, which he had studied carefully, and he noticed with satisfaction that the valley of St. Anton gives easy access to Italy. As he journeyed south, the reflections of that porter would have surprised his fellow travellers in the stuffy third-class carriage. He was thinking of a conversation he had had some days before in a café at Dijon with a young Englishman bound for Modane. We had bumped up against each other by chance in that strange flitting when all went to different places at different times, asking nothing of each other's business. Wake had greeted me rather shamefacedly, and had proposed dinner together. I'm not good at receiving apologies, and Wake's embarrassed me more than they embarrassed him. I'm a bit of a cad sometimes, he said. You know, I'm a better fellow than I sounded that night, Hannay. I mumbled something about not talking rot, the conventional phrase. What worried me was that the man was suffering. You could see it in his eyes. But that evening I got nearer Wake than ever before, and he and I became true friends, for he laid bare his soul before me. That was his trouble, that he could lay bare his soul, for ordinary healthy folk don't analyze their feelings. Wake did, and I think it brought him relief. Don't think I was ever your rival. I would no more have proposed to Mary than I would have married one of her aunts. She was so sure of herself, so happy in her single-heartedness, that she terrified me. My type of man is not meant for marriage, for women must be in the centre of life, and we must always be standing aside and looking on. It is a damnable thing to be left-handed. The trouble about you, my dear chap, I said, is that you're too hard to please. That's one way of putting it. I should put it more harshly. I hate more than I love. All we humanitarians and pacifists have hatred as our mainspring. Odd, isn't it, for people who preach brotherly love? But it's the truth. We're full of hate towards everything that doesn't square in with our ideas, everything that jars on our ladylike nerves. Fellows like you are so in love with their cause that they've no time or inclination to detest what thwarts them. We've no cause, only negatives, and that means hatred and self-torture and a beastly jaundice of soul. Then I knew that Wake's fault was not spiritual pride, as I had diagnosed it at Biggleswick. The man was abased with humility. "I see more than other people see," he went on, "and I feel more. That's the curse on me. You're a happy man, and you get things done, because you only see one side of a case, one thing at a time. How would you like it if 1,000 strings were always tugging at you, if you saw that every course meant the sacrifice of lovely and desirable things, or even the shattering of what you know to be unreplaceable? I'm the kind of stuff poets are made of, but I haven't got the poet's gift, so I stagger about the world left-handed and game-legged. Take the war. For me to fight would be worse than for another man to run away. From the bottom of my heart I believe that it needn't have happened, and that all war is a blistering iniquity. And yet belief has got very little to do with virtue. I'm not as good a man as you, Hannay, who have never thought out anything in your life. My time in the Labour Battalion taught me something. I knew that with all my fine aspirations I wasn't as true a man as fellows whose talk was silly oaths and who didn't care a tinker's curse about their soul. I remember that I looked at him with a sudden understanding. "I think I know you. You're the sort of chap who won't fight for his country because he can't be sure that she's altogether in the right, but he'd cheerfully die for her, right or wrong." His face relaxed in a slow smile. "Queer that you should say that. I think it's pretty near the truth. Men like me aren't afraid to die, but they haven't quite the courage to live. Every man should be happy in a service like you when he obeys orders. I couldn't get on in any service. I lack the bump of veneration. I can't swallow things merely because I'm told to. My sort are always talking about service, but we haven't the temperament to serve. I'd give all I have to be an ordinary cog in the wheel instead of a confounded outsider who finds fault with the machinery. Take a great, violent, high-handed fellow like you. You can sink yourself till you become only a name and a number. I couldn't if I tried. I'm not sure I want to either. I cling to the odds and ends that are my own." "I wish I had had you in my battalion a year ago," I said. "No, you don't. I'd only have been a nuisance. I've been a Fabian since Oxford, but you're a better socialist than me. I'm a rancid individualist." "But you must be feeling better about the war?" I asked. "Not a bit of it. I'm still lusting for the heads of the politicians that made it and continue it. But I want to help my country. Honestly, Hannay, I love the old place. More, I think, than I love myself, and that's saying a devilish lot. Short of fighting, which would be to sin against the Holy Spirit for me, I'll do my damnedest. But you'll remember I'm not used to teamwork. If I'm a jealous player, beat me over the head." His voice was almost wistful, and I liked him enormously. "Blenkiron will see to that," I said. "We're going to break you to harness, Wake, and then you'll be a happy man. You keep your mind on the game and forget about yourself. That's the cure for jibbers." As I journeyed to St. Anton, I thought a lot about that talk. He was quite right about Mary, who would never have married him. A man with such an angular soul couldn't fit into another's. And then I thought that the chief thing about Mary was just her serene certainty. Her eyes had that settled, happy look that I remembered to have seen only in one other human face, and that was Peter's. But I wondered if Peter's eyes were still the same. I found the cottage, a little wooden thing which had been left perched on its knoll when the big hotels grew around it. It had a fence in front, but behind it was open to the hillside. At the gate stood a bent old woman with a face like a pippin. My make-up must have been good, for she accepted me before I introduced myself. "God be thanked you are come," she cried. "The poor lieutenant needed a man to keep him company. He sleeps now, as he does always in the afternoon, for his leg wearies him in the night. But he is brave, like a soldier. Come, I will show you the house, for you two will be alone now." Stepping softly, she led me indoors, pointing with a warning finger to the little bedroom where Peter slept. I found a kitchen with a big stove and a rough floor of planking, on which lay some badly cured skins. Off it was a sort of pantry with a bed for me. She showed me the pots and pans for cooking, and the store she had laid in, and where to find water and fuel. "I will do the marketing daily," she said, "and if you need me, my dwelling is 1/2 a mile up the road beyond the new church. God be with you, young man, and be kind to that wounded one." When the widow Zumamata had departed, I sat down in Peter's armchair and took stock of the place. It was quiet and simple and homely, and through the window came the gleam of snow on the diamond hills. On the table beside the stove were Peter's cherished belongings, his buckskin pouch and the pipe which Janny Grobelaar had carved for him in St. Helena, an aluminium field matchbox I had given him, a cheap large print Bible such as padres present to well-disposed privates, and an old battered Pilgrim's Progress with gaudy pictures. The illustration at which I opened showed Faithful going up to heaven from the fire of Vanity Fair like a woodcock that has just been flushed. Everything in the room was exquisitely neat, and I knew that that was Peter and not the widow Zumamata. On a peg behind the door hung his much-mended coat, and sticking out of a pocket I recognized a sheaf of my own letters. In one corner stood something which I had forgotten about, an invalid chair. The sight of Peter's plain little oddments made me feel solemn. I wondered if his eyes would be like Mary's now, for I could not conceive what life would be for him as a cripple. Very silently I opened the bedroom door and slipped inside. He was lying on a camp bedstead with one of those striped Swiss blankets pulled up round his ears, and he was asleep. It was the old Peter beyond doubt. He had the hunter's gift of breathing evenly through his nose, and the white scar on the deep brown of his forehead was what I had always remembered. The only change since I last saw him was that he had let his beard grow again, and it was grey. As I looked at him, the remembrance of all we had been through together flooded back upon me, and I could have cried with joy at being beside him. Women, bless their hearts, can never know what long comradeship means to men. It is something not in their lives, something that belongs only to that wild, undomesticated world which we forswear when we find our mates. Even Mary understood only a bit of it. I had just won her love, which was the greatest thing that ever came my way, but if she had entered at that moment, I would scarcely have turned my head. I was back again in the old life, and was not thinking of the new. Suddenly I saw that Peter was awake and was looking at me. "Dick," he said in a whisper, "Dick, my old friend." The blanket was tossed off, and his long, lean arms were stretched out to me. I gripped his hands, and for a little we did not speak. Then I saw how woefully he had changed. His left leg had shrunk, and from the knee down was like a pipe stem. His face, when awake, showed the lines of hard suffering, and he seemed shorter by half a foot. But his eyes were still like Mary's. Indeed, they seemed to be more patient and peaceful than in the days when he sat beside me on the buck wagon and peered over the hunting veldt. I picked him up, he was no heavier than Mary, and carried him to his chair beside the stove. Then I boiled water and made tea, as we had so often done together. "Peter, old man," I said, "we're on trek again, and this is a very snug little rendezvous. We've had many good yarns, but this is going to be the best. First of all, how about your health?" "Good. I'm a strong man again, but slow, like a hippo cow. I have been lonely sometimes, but that is all by now. Tell me of the big battles." But I was hungry for news of him, and kept him to his own case. He had no complaint of his treatment, except that he did not like Germans. The doctors at the hospital had been clever, he said, and had done their best for him, but nerves and sinews and small bones had been so wrecked that they could not mend his leg, and Peter had all the Boer's dislike of amputation. One doctor had been in Damaraland and talked to him of those baked sunny places and made him homesick, but he returned always to his dislike of Germans. He had seen them herding our soldiers like brute beasts, and the commandant had a face like Stumm and a chin that stuck out and wanted hitting. He made an exception for the great airman Lensch, who had downed him. "He is a white man, that one," he said. "He came to see me in hospital and told me a lot of things. I think he made them treat me well. He is a big man, Dick, who would make two of me, and he has a round, merry face and pale eyes like Fricky Selliers, who could put a bullet through a paw's head at 200 yards. He said he was sorry I was lame, for he hoped to have more fights with me. Some woman that tells fortunes had said that I would be the end of him, but he reckoned she had got the thing the wrong way on. I hope he will come through this war, for he is a good man, though a German. But the others, they are like the fool in the Bible, fat and ugly in good fortune, and proud and vicious when their luck goes. They are not a people to be happy with." Then he told me that to keep his spirits he had amused himself with playing a game. He had prided himself on being a Boer, and spoke coldly of the British. He had also, I gathered, imparted many things calculated to deceive. So he left Germany with good marks, and at Switzerland had held himself aloof from the other British wounded, on the advice of Blenkiron, who had met him as soon as he crossed the frontier. I gathered it was Blenkiron who had him sent to Saint-Anton, and in his time there, as a disgruntled Boer, he had mixed a good deal with Germans. They had pumped him about our air service, and Peter had told them many ingenious lies, and heard curious things in return. "They are working hard, Dick," he said. "Never forget that. The German is a stout enemy, and when we beat him with a machine he sweats till he has invented a new one. They have great pilots, but never so many good ones as we, and I do not think in ordinary fighting they can ever beat us. But you must watch Lensch, for I fear him. He has a new machine, I hear, with great engines and a short wing spread, but the wings so cambered that he can climb fast. That will be a surprise to spring upon us. You will say that we'll soon better it. So we shall, but if it was used at a time when we were pushing hard, it might make the little difference that loses battles." "You mean," I said, "that if we had a great attack ready, and had driven all the Boche planes back from our front, Lensch and his circus might get over in spite of us and blow the gaff?" "Yes," he said solemnly. "Or if we were attacked and had a weak spot, Lensch might show the Germans where to get through. I do not think we are going to attack for a long time, but I am pretty sure that Germany is going to fling every man against us. That is the talk of my friends, and it is not bluff." That night I cooked our modest dinner, and we smoked our pipes with the stove door open and the good smell of wood smoke in our nostrils. I told him of all my doings, and of the wild birds and ivory and the job we were engaged on. Blenkiron's instructions were that we too should live humbly and keep our eyes and ears open, for we were outside suspicion, the cantankerous lame Boer and his loutish servant from Arosa. Somewhere in the place was a rendezvous of our enemies, and thither came Cornelius on his dark errands. Peter nodded his head sagely. "I think I have guessed the place. The daughter of the old woman used to pull my chair sometimes down to the village, and I have sat in cheap inns and talked to servants. There is a fresh water pan there. It is all covered with snow now, and beside it there is a big house that they call the Pink Chalet. I do not know much about it, except that rich folk live in it, for I know the other houses, and they are harmless. Also the big hotels, which are too cold and public for strangers to meet in." I put Peter to bed, and it was a joy to me to look after him, to give him his tonic and prepare the hot water bottle that comforted his neuralgia. His behaviour was like a docile child's, and he never lapsed from his sunny temper, though I could see how his leg gave him hell. They had tried massage for it and had given up, and there was nothing for him but to endure till nature and his tough constitution deadened the tortured nerves again. I shifted my bed out of the pantry and slept in the room with him, and when I woke in the night, as one does the first time in a strange place, I could tell by his breathing that he was wakeful and suffering. Next day a bath chair containing a grizzled cripple and pushed by a limping peasant might have been seen descending the long hill to the village. It was clear frosty weather, which makes the cheeks tingle, and I felt so full of beans that it was hard to remember my game leg. The valley was shut in on the east by a great mass of rocks and glaciers, belonging to a mountain whose top could not be seen. But on the south, above the snowy fir woods, there was a most delicate lace-like peak with a point like a needle. I looked at it with interest, for beyond it lay the valley which led to the Staub Pass, and beyond that was Italy and Mary. The old village of Saint-Anton had one long narrow street which bent at right angles to a bridge which spanned the river flowing from the lake. Thence the road climbed steeply, but at the other end of the street it ran on the level by the water's edge, lined with gimcrack boarding houses now shuttered to the world, and a few villas and patches of garden. At the far end, just before it plunged into a pine wood, a promontory jutted into the lake, leaving a broad space between the road and the water. Here were the grounds of a more considerable dwelling, snow-covered laurels and rhododendrons, with one or two bigger trees, and just on the water edge stood the house itself, called the Pink Chalet. I wheeled Peter past the entrance on the crackling snow of the highway. Seen through the gaps of the trees, the front looked new, but the back part seemed to be of some age, for I could see high walls, broken by few windows, hanging over the water. The place was no more a chalet than a dungeon, but I suppose the name was given in honour of a wooden gallery above the front door. The whole thing was washed in an ugly pink. There were outhouses, garage or stables among the trees, and at the entrance there were fairly recent tracks of an automobile. On our way back we had some very bad beer in a cafe and made friends with the woman who kept it. Peter had to tell her his story, and I trotted out my aunt in Zurich, and in the end we heard her grievances. She was a true Swiss, angry at all the belligerents who had spoiled their livelihood, hating Germany most, but also fearing her most. Coffee, tea, fuel, bread, even milk and cheese were hard to get and cost a ransom. It would take the land years to recover, and there would be no more tourists, for there was little money left in the world. I dropped a question about the Pink Chalet, and was told that it belonged to one Schweigler, a professor of Bern, an old man who came sometimes for a few days in the summer. It was often let, but not now. Asked if it was occupied, she remarked that some friends of the Schweiglers, rich people from Basel, had been there for the winter. They come and go in great cars, she said bitterly, and they bring their food from the cities. They spend no money in this poor place. Presently Peter and I fell into a routine of life, as if we had always kept house together. In the morning he went abroad in his chair, and in the afternoon I would hobble about on my own errands. We sank into the background and took its colour, and a less conspicuous pair never faced the eye of suspicion. Once a week a young Swiss officer, whose business it was to look after British wounded, paid us a hurried visit. I used to get letters from my aunt in Zurich, and sometimes with the postmark of a Rosa, and now and then these letters would contain curiously worded advice or instructions from him whom my aunt called the kind patron. Generally I was told to be patient. Sometimes I had a word about the health of my little cousin across the mountains. Once I was bidden expect a friend of the patron's, the wise doctor of whom he had often spoken, but though after that I shadowed the Pink Chalet for 2 days, no doctor appeared. My investigations were a barren business. I used to go down to the village in the afternoon and sit in an out-of-the-way cafe, talking slow German with peasants and hotel porters, but there was little to learn. I knew all there was to hear about the Pink Chalet, and that was nothing. A young man who skied stayed for 3 nights and spent his days on the Alps above the fir woods. A party of 4, including 2 women, were reported to have been there for a night, all ramifications of the rich family of Basel. I studied the house from the lake, which should have been nicely swept into ice rinks, but from lack of visitors was a heap of blown snow. The high old walls of the back part were built straight from the water's edge. I remember I tried a short-cut through the grounds to the high road and was given good afternoon by a smiling German manservant. One way and another I gathered there were a good many serving men about the place, too many for the infrequent guests, but beyond this I discovered nothing. Not that I was bored, for I had always Peter to turn to. He was thinking a lot about South Africa, and the thing he liked best was to go over with me every detail of our old expeditions. They belonged to a life which he could think about without pain, whereas the war was too near and bitter for him. He liked to hobble out of doors after the darkness came and look at his old friends, the stars. He called them by the words they use on the veldt, and the first star of morning he called the voorloper, the little boy who inspans the oxen, a name I had not heard for 20 years. Many a great yarn was spun in the long evenings, but I always went to bed with a sore heart. The longing in his eyes was too urgent, longing not for old days or far countries, but for the health and strength which had once been his pride. One night I told him about Mary. "She will be a happy mizzy," he said, "but you will need to be very clever with her, for women are queer cattle, and you and I don't know their ways. They tell me English women do not cook and make clothes like our vrouws, so what will she find to do? I doubt an idle woman would be like a mealy-fed horse." It was no good explaining to him the kind of girl Mary was, for that was a world entirely beyond his ken. But I could see that he felt lonelier than ever at my news. So I told him of the house I meant to have in England when the war was over. An old house in a green hilly country, with fields that would carry 4 head of cattle to the morgen, and furrows of clear water, and orchards of plums and apples. "And you will stay with us all the time," I said. "You will have your own rooms and your own boy to look after you, and you will help me to farm, and we will catch fish together, and shoot the wild ducks when they come up from the pans in the evening. I have found a better countryside than the Haute-Bosch, where you and I plan to have a farm. It is a blessed and happy place, England." He shook his head. "You are a kind man, Dick, but your pretty Missy won't want an ugly old fellow like me hobbling about her house. I do not think I will get back to Africa, for I should be sad there in the sun. I will find a little place in England, and some day I will visit you, old friend." That night his stoicism seemed for the first time to fail him. He was silent for a long time and went early to bed, where I can vouch for it he did not sleep. But he must have thought a lot in the night time, for in the morning he had got himself in hand and was as cheerful as a sandboy. I watched his philosophy with amazement. It was far beyond anything I could have compassed myself. He was so frail and so poor, for he had never had anything in the world but his bodily fitness, and he had lost that now. And remember, he had lost it after some months of glittering happiness, for in the air he had found the element for which he had been born. Sometimes he dropped a hint of those days when he lived in the clouds and invented a new kind of battle, and his voice always grew hoarse. I could see that he ached with longing for their return, and yet he never had a word of complaint. That was the ritual he had set himself, his point of honour, and he faced the future with the same kind of courage as that with which he had tackled a wild beast or Lensch himself. Only it needed a far bigger brand of fortitude. Another thing was that he had found religion. I doubt if that is the right way to put it, for he had always had it. Men who live in the wilds know they are in the hands of God. But his old kind had been a tattered thing, more like heathen superstition, though it had always kept him humble. But now he had taken to reading the Bible, and to thinking in his lonely nights, and he had got a creed of his own. I dare say it was crude enough. I am sure it was unorthodox. But if the proof of religion is that it gives a man a prop in bad days, then Peter's was the real thing. He used to ferret about in the Bible and the Pilgrim's Progress, they were both equally inspired in his eyes, and find texts which he interpreted in his own way to meet his case. He took everything quite literally. What happened 3,000 years ago in Palestine might, for all he minded, have been going on next door. I used to chaff him and tell him that he was like the Kaiser, very good at fitting the Bible to his purpose, but his sincerity was so complete that he only smiled. I remember one night when he had been thinking about his flying days, he found a passage in Thessalonians about the dead rising to meet their Lord in the air, and that cheered him a lot. Peter, I could see, had the notion that his time here wouldn't be very long, and he liked to think that when he got his release he would find once more the old rapture. Once, when I said something about his patience, he said he had got to try to live up to Mr. Standfast. He had fixed on that character to follow, though he would have preferred Mr. Valiant for truth if he thought himself good enough. He used to talk about Mr. Standfast in his queer way, as if he were a friend of us both, like Blenkiron. I tell you, I was humbled out of all my pride by the sight of Peter, so uncomplaining and gentle and wise. The Almighty himself couldn't have made a prig out of him, and he never would have thought of preaching. Only once did he give me advice. I had always a liking for shortcuts, and I was getting a bit restive under the long inaction. One day, when I expressed my feelings on the matter, Peter upped and read from the Pilgrim's Progress. "Some also have wished that the next way to their Father's house was here, that they might be troubled no more with either hills or mountains to go over, but the way is the way, and there is an end." All the same, when we got into March and nothing happened, I grew pretty anxious. Blenkiron had said we were fighting against time, and here were the weeks slipping away. His letters came occasionally, always in the shape of communications from my aunt. One told me that I would soon be out of a job, for Peter's repatriation was just about through, and he might get his movement order any day. Another spoke of my little cousin over the hills, and said that she hoped soon to be going to a place called Santa Chiara in the Val Saluzzana. I got out the map in a hurry and measured the distance from there to San Anton, and pored over the two roads thither, the short one by the Staub Pass and the long one by the Mariolana. These letters made me think that things were nearing a climax, but still no instructions came. I had nothing to report in my own messages. I had discovered nothing in the Pink Chalet but idle servants. I was not even sure if the Pink Chalet were a harmless villa, and I hadn't come within 1,000 miles of finding Helios. All my desire to imitate Peter's stoicism didn't prevent me from getting occasionally rattled and despondent. The one thing I could do was to keep fit, for I had a notion I might soon want all my bodily strength. I had to keep up my pretense of lameness in the daytime, so I used to take my exercise at night. I would sleep in the afternoon when Peter had his siesta, and then about 10 in the evening, after putting him to bed, I would slip out of doors and go for a 4 or 5 hours tramp. Wonderful were those midnight wanderings. I pushed up through the snow-laden pines to the ridges where the snow lay in great wreaths and scallops, till I stood on a crest with the frozen world at my feet, and above me a host of glittering stars. Once, on a night of full moon, I reached the glacier at the valley head, scrambled up the moraine to where the ice began, and peered fearfully into the spectral crevasses. At such hours I had the earth to myself, for there was not a sound except the slipping of a burden of snow from the trees, or the crack and rustle which reminded me that a glacier was a moving river. The war seemed very far away, and I felt the littleness of our human struggles, till I thought of Peter turning from side to side to find ease in the cottage far below me. Then I realized that the spirit of man was the greatest thing in this spacious world. I would get back about 3 or 4, have a bath in the water which had been warming in my absence, and creep into bed, almost ashamed of having 2 sound legs, when a better man a yard away had but one. Oddly enough, at these hours there seemed more life in the Pink Chalet than by day. Once, tramping across the lake long after midnight, I saw lights in the lakefront, in windows which for ordinary were blank and shuttered. Several times I cut across the grounds when the moon was dark. On one such occasion a great car with no lights swept up the drive, and I heard low voices at the door. Another time a man ran hastily past me and entered the house by a little door on the eastern side, which I had not before noticed. Slowly the conviction began to grow on me that we were not wrong in marking down this place, that things went on within it which it deeply concerned us to discover. But I was puzzled to think of a way. I might butt inside, but for all I knew it would be upsetting Blenkiron's plans, for he had given me no instructions about housebreaking. All this unsettled me worse than ever. I began to lie awake, planning some means of entrance. I would be a peasant from the next valley who had twisted his ankle. I would go seeking an imaginary cousin among the servants. I would start a fire in the place and have the doors flung open to zealous neighbors. And then suddenly I got instructions in a letter from Blenkiron. It came inside a parcel of warm socks that arrived from my kind aunt. But the letter for me was not from her. It was in Blenkiron's large, sprawling hand, and the style of it was all his own. He told me that he had about finished his job. He had got his line on Helios, who was the bird he expected, and that bird would soon wing its way southward across the mountains for the reason I knew of. "We've got an almighty move on," he wrote, "and please God you're going to hustle some in the next week. It's going better than I ever hoped." But something was still to be done. He had struck a countryman, one Clarence Dunn, a journalist of Kansas City, whom he had taken into the business. Him he described as a crackerjack and commended to my esteem. He was coming to San Anton, for there was a game afoot at the Pink Chalet which he would give me news of. I was to meet him next evening at 9:15 at the little door in the east end of the house. "For the love of Mike, Dick," he concluded, "be on time and do everything Clarence tells you as if he was me. It's a mighty complex affair, but you and he have sand enough to pull through. Don't worry about your little cousin. She's safe and out of the job now." My first feeling was one of immense relief, especially at the last words. I read the letter a dozen times to make sure I had its meaning. A flash of suspicion crossed my mind that it might be a fake, principally because there was no mention of Peter, who had figured large in the other missives. But why should Peter be mentioned when he wasn't on in this piece? The signature convinced me. Ordinarily Blenkiron signed himself in full, with a fine commercial flourish, but when I was at the front he had got into the habit of making a kind of hieroglyphic of his surname to me and sticking J.S. after it in a bracket. That was how this letter was signed, and it was sure proof it was all right. I spent that day and the next in wild spirits. Peter spotted what was on, though I did not tell him for fear of making him envious. I had to be extra kind to him, for I could see that he ached to have a hand in the business. Indeed, he asked shyly if I couldn't fit him in, and I had to lie about it and say it was only another of my aimless circumnavigations of the Pink Chalet. "Try and find me something where I can help," he pleaded. "I'm pretty strong still, though I'm lame, and I can shoot a bit." I declared that he would be used in time, that Blenkiron had promised he would be used, but for the life of me I couldn't see how. At 9 o'clock on the evening appointed, I was on the lake opposite the house, close in under the shore, making my way to the rendezvous. It was a coal black night, for though the air was clear, the stars were shining with a little light, and the moon had not yet risen. With a premonition that I might be long away from food, I had brought some slabs of chocolate, and my pistol and torch were in my pocket. It was bitter cold, but I had ceased to mind weather, and I wore my one suit and no overcoat. The house was like a tomb for silence. There was no crack of light anywhere, and none of those smells of smoke and food which proclaim habitation. It was an eerie job scrambling up the steep bank east of the place to where the flat of the garden started in a darkness so great that I had to grope my way like a blind man. I found the little door by feeling along the edge of the building. Then I stepped into an adjacent clump of laurels to wait on my companion. He was there before me. "Say," I heard a rich Middle West voice whisper, "are you Joseph Zimmer? I'm not shouting any names, but I guess you are the guy I was told to meet here." "Mr. Dunn?" I whispered back. "The same," he replied. "Shake." I gripped a gloved and mittened hand which drew me towards the door. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Mr. Standfast by John Buchan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. I Lie on a Hard Bed. The journalist from Kansas City was a man of action. He wasted no words in introducing himself or unfolding his plan of campaign. "You've got to follow me, mister, and not deviate 1 inch from my tracks. The explaining part will come later. There's big business in this shack tonight." He unlocked the little door with scarcely a sound, slid the crust of snow from his boots, and preceded me into a passage as black as a cellar. The door swung smoothly behind us, and after the sharp out-of-doors the air smelled stuffy as the inside of a safe. A hand reached back to make sure that I followed. We appeared to be in a flagged passage under the main level of the house. My hobnailed boots slipped on the floor, and I steadied myself on the wall, which seemed to be of undressed stone. Mr. Dunn moved softly and assuredly, for he was better shod for the job than me, and his guiding hand came back constantly to make sure of my whereabouts. I remember that I felt just as I had felt when on that August night I had explored the crevice of the Coolin, the same sense that something queer was going to happen, the same recklessness and contentment. Moving a foot at a time with immense care, we came to a right-hand turning. 2 shallow steps led us to another passage, and then my groping hand struck a blind wall. The American was beside me, and his voice was close to my ear. "Got to crawl now," he whispered. "You lead, mister, while I shed this coat of mine. 8 feet on your stomach, and then upright." I wriggled through a low tunnel, broad enough to take 3 men abreast, but not 2 feet high. Halfway through I felt suffocated, for I never liked holes, and I had a momentary anxiety as to what we were after in this cellar pilgrimage. Presently I smelt free air and got onto my knees. "Right, mister?" came a whisper from behind. My companion seemed to be waiting till I was through before he followed. "Right," I answered, and very carefully rose to my feet. Then something happened behind me. There was a jar and a bump as if the roof of the tunnel had subsided. I turned sharply and groped at the mouth. I stuck my leg down and found a block. "Done," I said as loud as I dared. "Are you hurt? Where are you?" But no answer came. Even then I thought only of an accident. Something had miscarried, and I was cut off in the cellars of an unfriendly house, away from the man who knew the road and had a plan in his head. I was not so much frightened as exasperated. I turned from the tunnel mouth and groped into the darkness before me. I might as well prospect the kind of prison into which I had blundered. I took 3 steps, no more. My feet seemed suddenly to go from me and fly upward. So sudden was it that I fell heavy and dead like a log, and my head struck the floor with a crash that for a moment knocked me senseless. I was conscious of something falling on me and of an intolerable pressure on my chest. I struggled for breath and found my arms and legs pinned and my whole body in a kind of a wooden vice. I was sick with concussion and could do nothing but gasp and choke down my nausea. The cut in the back of my head was bleeding freely, and that helped to clear my wits, but I lay for a moment or two incapable of thought. I shut my eyes tight, as a man does when he is fighting with a swoon. When I opened them, there was light. It came from the left side of the room, the broad glare of a strong electric torch. I watched it stupidly, but it gave me the fillip needed to pick up the threads. I remembered the tunnel now and the Kansas journalist. Then, behind the light, I saw a face which pulled my flickering senses out of the mire. I saw the heavy ulster and the cap, which I had realized, though I had not seen, outside in the dark laurels. They belonged to the journalist, Clarence Dunn, the trusted emissary of Blenkiron. But I saw his face now, and it was that face which I had boasted to Bullivant I could never mistake again upon earth. I did not mistake it now, and I remember I had a faint satisfaction that I had made good my word. I had not mistaken it, for I had not had the chance to look at it till this moment. I saw with acid clearness the common denominator of all its disguises. The young man who lisped in the seaside villa, the stout philanthropist of Biggleswick, the pulpy, panic-stricken creature of the tube station, the trim French staff officer of the Picardy chateau. I saw more, for I saw it beyond the need of disguise. I was looking at von Schwabing, the exile, who had done more for Germany than any army commander. Mary's words came back to me, the most dangerous man in the world. I was not afraid or broken-hearted at failure, or angry, not yet, for I was too dazed and awestruck. I looked at him as one might look at some cataclysm of nature which had destroyed a continent. The face was smiling. "I am happy to offer you hospitality at last," it said. I pulled my wits farther out of the mud to attend to him. The crossbar on my chest pressed less hard, and I breathed better. But when I tried to speak, the words would not come. "We are old friends," he went on. "We have known each other quite intimately for 4 years, which is a long time in war. I have been interested in you, for you have a kind of crude intelligence, and you have compelled me to take you seriously. If you were cleverer, you would appreciate the compliment. But you were fool enough to think that you could beat me, and for that you must be punished. Oh no, don't flatter yourself you were ever dangerous. You were only troublesome and presumptuous, like a mosquito one flicks off one's sleeve." He was leaning against the side of a heavy closed door. He lit a cigar from a little gold tinder-box and regarded me with amused eyes. "You will have time for reflection, so I propose to enlighten you a little. You are an observer of little things. So? Did you ever see a cat with a mouse? The mouse runs about and hides and manoeuvres and thinks it is playing its own game. But at any moment the cat can stretch out its paw and put an end to it. You are the mouse, my poor General, for I believe you are one of those funny amateurs that the English call generals. At any moment during the last 9 months I could have put an end to you with a nod." My nausea had stopped, and I could understand what he said, though I had still no power to reply. "Let me explain," he went on. "I watched with amusement your gambols at Biggleswick. My eyes followed you when you went to the Clyde and in your stupid twistings in Scotland. I gave you rope because you were futile, and I had graver things to attend to. I allowed you to amuse yourself at your British front with childish investigations and to play the fool in Paris. I have followed every step of your course in Switzerland, and I have helped your idiotic Yankee friend to plot against myself. While you thought you were drawing your net around me, I was drawing mine around you. I assure you it has been a charming relaxation from serious business." I knew the man was lying. Some part was true, for he had clearly fooled Blenkiron, but I remembered the hurried flight from Biggleswick and Eaucourt Sainte Anne when the game was certainly against him. He had me at his mercy, and he was wreaking his vanity on me. That made him smaller in my eyes, and my first awe began to pass. "I never cherish rancour, you know," he said. "In my business it is silly to be angry, for it wastes energy. But I do not tolerate insolence, my dear General, and my country has the habit of doing justice on her enemies. It may interest you to know that the end is not far off. Germany has faced a jealous world in arms, and she is about to be justified of her great courage. She has broken up bit by bit the clumsy organization of her opponents. Where is Russia today, the steamroller that was to crush us? Where is the poor dupe Romania? Where is the strength of Italy, who was once to do wonders for what she called liberty? Broken, all of them. I have played my part in that work, and now the need is past. My country, with free hands, is about to turn upon your armed rabble in the West and drive it into the Atlantic. Then we shall deal with the ragged remains of France and the handful of noisy Americans. By midsummer there will be a peace dictated by triumphant Germany." "By God, there won't!" I had found my voice at last. "By God, there will," he said pleasantly. "It is what you call a mathematical certainty. You will no doubt die bravely, like the savage tribes that your empire used to conquer. But we have the greater discipline, and the strongest spirit, and the bigger brain. Stupidity is always punished in the end, and you are a stupid race. Do not think that your kinsmen across the Atlantic will save you. They are a commercial people, and by no means sure of themselves. When they have blustered a little, they will see reason, and find some means of saving their faces. Their comic president will make a speech or two, and write us a solemn note, and we will reply with the serious rhetoric which he loves, and then we shall kiss and be friends. You know in your heart that it will be so." A strange apathy seemed to settle on me. This bragging did not make me angry, and I had no longer any wish to contradict him. It may have been the result of the fall, but my mind had stopped working. I heard his voice as one listens casually to the ticking of a clock. "I will tell you more," he was saying. "This is the evening of the 18th day of March. Your generals in France expect an attack, but they are not sure where it will come. Some think it may be in Champagne, or on the Aisne, some at Ypres, some at Saint-Quentin. Well, my dear General, you alone will I take into our confidence. On the morning of the 21st, 3 days from now, we attack the right wing of the British army. In 2 days we shall be in Amiens. On the 3rd we shall have driven a wedge as far as the sea. Then, in a week or so, we shall have rolled up your army from the right, and presently we shall be in Boulogne and Calais. After that Paris falls, and then peace." I made no answer. The word Amiens recalled Mary, and I was trying to remember the day in January when she and I had motored south from that pleasant city. "Why do I tell you these things? Your intelligence, for you are not altogether foolish, will have supplied the answer. It is because your life is over, As your Shakespeare says, the rest is silence. No, I am not going to kill you. That would be crude, and I hate crudities. I am going now on a little journey, and when I return in 24 hours, you will be my companion. You are going to visit Germany, my dear General." That woke me to attention, and he noticed it, for he went on with gusto. "You have heard of the Untergrundbahn? No? And you boast of an intelligence service. Yet your ignorance is shared by the whole of your general staff. It is a little organization of my own. By it we can take unwilling and dangerous people inside our frontier to be dealt with as we please. Some have gone from England and many from France. Officially, I believe they are recorded as missing, but they did not go astray on any battlefield. They have been gathered from their homes or from hotels or offices or even the busy streets. I will not conceal from you that the service of our underground railway is a little irregular from England and France, but from Switzerland it is smooth as a trunk line. There are unwatched spots on the frontier, and we have our agents among the frontier guards, and we have no difficulty about passes. It is a pretty device, and you will soon be privileged to observe its working. In Germany I cannot promise you comfort, but I do not think your life will be dull." As he spoke these words, his urbane smile changed to a grin of impish malevolence. Even through my torpor I felt the venom, and I shivered. "When I return I shall have another companion." His voice was honeyed again. "There is a certain pretty lady who is to be the bait to entice me into Italy. It was so? Well, I have fallen to the bait. I have arranged that she shall meet me this very night at a mountain inn on the Italian side. I have arranged, too, that she shall be alone. She is an innocent child, and I do not think that she has been more than a tool in the clumsy hands of your friends. She will come with me when I ask her, and we shall be a merry party in the Underground Express." My apathy vanished, and every nerve in me was alive at the words. "You cur!" I cried. "She loathes the sight of you. She wouldn't touch you with the end of a barge pole." He flicked the ash from his cigar. "I think you are mistaken. I am very persuasive, and I do not like to use compulsion with a woman. But willing or not, she will come with me. I have worked hard, and I am entitled to my pleasure, and I have set my heart on that little lady." There was something in his tone, gross, leering, assured, half contemptuous, that made my blood boil. He had fairly got me on the raw, and the hammer beat violently in my forehead. I could have wept with sheer rage, and it took all my fortitude to keep my mouth shut, but I was determined not to add to his triumph. He looked at his watch. "Time passes," he said. "I must depart to my charming assignation. I will give your remembrances to the lady. Forgive me for making no arrangements for your comfort till I return. Your constitution is so sound that it will not suffer from a day's fasting. To set your mind at rest, I may tell you that escape is impossible. This mechanism has been proved too often, and if you did break loose from it, my servants would deal with you. But I must speak a word of caution. If you tamper with it or struggle too much, it will act in a curious way. The floor beneath you covers a shaft which runs to the lake below. Set a certain spring at work, and you may find yourself shot down into the water far below the ice, where your body will rot till the spring. That, of course, is an alternative open to you, if you do not care to wait for my return." He lit a fresh cigar, waved his hand, and vanished through the doorway. As it shut behind him, the sound of his footsteps instantly died away. The walls must have been as thick as a prison's. I suppose I was what people in books call stunned. The illumination during the past few minutes had been so dazzling that my brain could not master it. I remember very clearly that I did not think about the ghastly failure of our scheme, or the German plans which had been insolently unfolded to me as to one dead to the world. I saw a single picture, an inn in a snowy valley. I saw it as a small place like Peter's cottage. A solitary girl, that smiling devil who had left me, and then the unknown terror of the Underground Railway. I think my courage went for a bit, and I cried with feebleness and rage. The hammer in my forehead had stopped, for it only beat when I was angry in action. Now that I lay trapped, the manhood had slipped out of my joints, and if Ivory had still been in the doorway, I think I would have whined for mercy. I would have offered him all the knowledge I had in the world if he had promised to leave Mary alone. Happily he wasn't there, and there was no witness of my cowardice. Happily, too, it is just as difficult to be a coward for long as to be a hero. It was Blenkiron's phrase about Mary that pulled me together. She can't scare and she can't soil. No, by heaven, she couldn't. I could trust my lady far better than I could trust myself. I was still sick with anxiety, but I was getting a pull on myself. I was done in, but Ivery would get no triumph out of me. Either I would go under the ice, or I would find a chance of putting a bullet through my head before I crossed the frontier. If I could do nothing else, I could perish decently. And then I laughed, and I knew I was past the worst. What made me laugh was the thought of Peter. I had been pitying him an hour ago for having only one leg. But now he was abroad in the living, breathing world with years before him, and I lay in the depths, limbless and lifeless, with my number up. I began to muse on the cold water under the ice, where I could go if I wanted. I did not think that I would take that road, for a man's chances are not gone till he is stone dead, but I was glad the way existed. And then I looked at the wall in front of me, and very far up I saw a small square window. The stars had been clouded when I entered that accursed house, but the mist must have cleared. I saw my old friend Orion, the hunter's star, looking through the bars, and that suddenly made me think. Peter and I had watched them by night, and I knew the place of all the chief constellations in relation to the St. Anton Valley. I believed that I was in a room on the lake side of the Pink Chalet. I must be, if Ivery had spoken the truth. But if so, I could not conceivably see Orion from its window. There was no other possible conclusion. I must be in a room on the east side of the house, and Ivery had been lying. He had already lied in his boasting of how he had outwitted me in England and at the front. He might be lying about Mary. No, I dismissed that hope. Those words of his had rung true enough. I thought for a minute and concluded that he had lied to terrorize me and keep me quiet. Therefore this infernal contraption had probably its weak point. I reflected, too, that I was pretty strong, far stronger probably than Ivery imagined, for he had never seen me stripped. Since the place was pitch dark, I could not guess how the thing worked, but I could feel the crossbars rigid on my chest and legs, and the side bars which pinned my arms to my sides. I drew a long breath and tried to force my elbows apart. Nothing moved, nor could I raise the bars on my legs the smallest fraction. Again I tried, and again. The side bar on my right seemed to be less rigid than the others. I managed to get my right hand raised above the level of my thigh, and then with a struggle I got a grip with it on the crossbar, which gave me a small leverage. With a mighty effort I drove my right elbow and shoulder against the side bar. It seemed to give slightly. I summoned all my strength and tried again. There was a crack and then a splintering, the massive bar shuffled limply back, and my right arm was free to move laterally, though the crossbar prevented me from raising it. With some difficulty I got at my coat pocket, where reposed my electric torch and my pistol. With immense labour and no little pain, I pulled the former out and switched it on by drawing the catch against the crossbar. Then I saw my prison house. It was a little square chamber, very high, with on my left the massive door by which Ivery had departed. The dark baulks of my rack were plain, and I could roughly make out how the thing had been managed. Some spring had tilted up the flooring and dropped the framework from its place in the right-hand wall. It was clamped, I observed, by an arrangement in the floor just in front of the door. If I could get rid of that catch, it would be easy to free myself, for to a man of my strength the weight would not be impossibly heavy. My fortitude had come back to me, and I was living only in the moment, choking down any hope of escape. My first job was to destroy the catch that clamped down the rack, and for that my only weapon was my pistol. I managed to get the little electric torch jammed in the corner of the crossbar, where it lit up the floor towards the door. Then it was hell's own business extricating the pistol from my pocket. Wrist and fingers were always cramping, and I was in terror that I might drop it where I could not retrieve it. I forced myself to think out calmly the question of the clamp, for a pistol bullet is a small thing, and I could not afford to miss. I reasoned it out from my knowledge of mechanics, and came to the conclusion that the centre of gravity was a certain bright spot of metal which I could just see under the crossbars. It was bright, and so must have been recently repaired, and that was another reason for thinking it important. The question was how to hit it, for I could not get the pistol in line with my eye. Let anyone try that kind of shooting with a bent arm over a bar when you are lying flat and looking at the mark from under the bar, and he will understand its difficulties. I had 6 shots in my revolver, and I must fire 2 or 3 ranging shots in any case. I must not exhaust all my cartridges, for I must have a bullet left for any servant who came to pry, and I wanted one in reserve for myself. But I did not think shots would be heard outside the room. The walls were too thick. I held my wrist rigid above the crossbar and fired. The bullet was an inch to the right of the piece of bright steel. Moving a fraction, I fired again. I had grazed it on the left. With aching eyes glued on the mark, I tried a third time. I saw something leap apart, and suddenly the whole framework under which I lay fell loose and mobile. I was very cool, and restored the pistol to my pocket, and took the torch in my hand before I moved. Fortune had been kind, for I was free. I turned on my face, humped my back, and without much trouble crawled out from under the contraption. I did not allow myself to think of ultimate escape, for that would only flurry me, and one step at a time was enough. I remember that I dusted my clothes and found that the cut at the back of my head had stopped bleeding. I retrieved my hat, which had rolled into a corner when I fell. Then I turned my attention to the next step. The tunnel was impossible, and the only way was the door. If I had stopped to think, I would have known that the chances against getting out of such a house were 1,000 to 1. The pistol shots had been muffled by the cavernous walls, but the place, as I knew, was full of servants, and even if I passed the immediate door, I would be collared in some passage. But I had myself so well in hand that I tackled the door as if I had been prospecting to sink a new shaft in Rhodesia. It had no handle, nor, so far as I could see, a keyhole. But I noticed, as I turned my torch on the ground, that from the clamp which I had shattered, a brass rod sunk in the floor led to one of the doorposts. Obviously the thing worked by a spring and was connected with the mechanism of the rack. A wild thought entered my mind and brought me to my feet. I pushed the door and it swung slowly open. The bullet which freed me had released the spring which controlled it. Then, for the first time, against all my maxims of discretion, I began to hope. I took off my hat and felt my forehead burning, so that I rested it for a moment on the cool wall. Perhaps my luck still held. With a rush came thoughts of Mary and Blenkiron and Peter and everything we had laboured for, and I was mad to win. I had no notion of the interior of the house or where lay the main door to the outer world. My torch showed me a long passage with something like a door at the far end, but I clicked it off, for I did not dare to use it now. The place was deadly quiet. As I listened, I seemed to hear a door open far away, and then silence fell again. I groped my way down the passage till I had my hands on the far door. I hoped it might open on the hall, where I could escape by a window or a balcony, for I judged the outer door would be locked. I listened, and there came no sound from within. It was no use lingering, so very stealthily I turned the handle and opened it a crack. It creaked, and I waited with beating heart on discovery, for inside I saw the glow of light. But there was no movement, so it must be empty. I poked my head in, and then followed with my body. It was a large room, with logs burning in a stove, and the floor thick with rugs. It was lined with books, and on a table in the centre a reading lamp was burning. Several dispatch boxes stood on the table, and there was a little pile of papers. A man had been here a minute before, for a half-smoked cigar was burning on the edge of the inkstand. At that moment I recovered complete use of my wits and all my self-possession. More, there returned to me some of the old devil-may-careness which before had served me well. Ivory had gone, but this was his sanctum. Just as on the roofs of Erzurum I had burned to get at Stumm's papers, so now it was borne in on me that at all costs I must look at that pile. I advanced to the table and picked up the topmost paper. It was a little typewritten blue slip with the lettering in italics, and in a corner a curious involved stamp in red ink. On it I read, Die Wildvögel müssen heimkehren. At the same moment I heard steps, and the door opened on the far side. I stepped back towards the stove and fingered the pistol in my pocket. A man entered, a man with a scholar's stoop, an unkempt beard, and large, sleepy, dark eyes. At the sight of me he pulled up, and his whole body grew taut. It was the Portuguese Jew, whose back I had last seen at the smithy door in Skye, and who by the mercy of God had never seen my face. I stopped fingering my pistol, for I had an inspiration. Before he could utter a word, I got in first. Die Vögelein schweigen im Walde. His face broke into a pleasant smile, and he replied, Warte nur, balde ruhest du auch. Ach, he said in German, holding out his hand, you have come this way when we thought you would go by Modane. I welcome you, for I know your exploits. You are Conradi, who did so nobly in Italy? I bowed. Yes, I am Conradi, I said. End of chapter 16.